One of the key new features in version 3.0 are the SharePoint connectivity improvements that we've made in Capture Pro software. The feature that we're calling it is the SharePoint Index Setup Wizard, but the customer benefits that it provides are it saves time and effort required to map SharePoint library definitions to a job setup in Capture Pro software. What we're doing is we're intelligently interrogating and reading the settings for an existing customer's SharePoint site and using that to create a job setup in Capture Pro software. The customers invested a lot of money in setting up their SharePoint system, and now they want to add scanned documents to their libraries that they've set up. They want to add that capability to put that into their workflow, etc. Previously, before version 3.0, somebody would have to manually go through and see what the SharePoint site's set up for and manually create things in Capture Pro software and make sure they match and make sure the settings are right, and then test the output and then have it fail because there was a setting that was off or whatever it is. So what we're doing here is we're saving the time and effort that's required to create that job setup in Capture Pro software to match what the customer SharePoint site is. And this is done through the SharePoint Index Setup Wizard. So it enables customers to leverage their investment in SharePoint more easily and efficiently. Okay, because not only do we provide that mapping and that intelligence, but we also support more capabilities of SharePoint 2007 and 2010. And because we're doing all these things, it reduces the amount of time spent searching for information by ensuring data integrity when outputting batches to SharePoint. Because we leverage the metadata configuration that's already been established in the SharePoint site and automatically bring that metadata configuration over to Capture Pro software. So the SharePoint Index Setup Wizard imports the index configuration from SharePoint into Capture Pro software. So we're not creating SharePoint content. We're not creating a content type or a library. That library's already been set up. It's already been established. And now what we want to do is we want to bring that configuration in to create a job setup based on that configuration in Capture Pro software. So by importing the index configuration from SharePoint, it removes the need to manually create the corresponding index fields in Capture Pro. It removes the need to manually perform the index field mapping between Capture Pro and the customer SharePoint system. It automatically and intelligently configures Capture Pro index fields based on the column configuration in SharePoint. So it brings over syntax rules. Is this a text field? Is this a number field? Is this a currency field? If there are default values in a SharePoint index field, we can bring those default values over to Capture Pro. If the field's required in SharePoint, we can make sure it's required in Capture Pro. If there's a minimum and maximum length of the index field, we can bring that over to Capture Pro. And even if there's a range of values, in other words, the value can only be between 1 and 100, we'll make sure that when we create the index field in Capture Pro, that we'll configure the input format in the syntax that we use to make sure that value can only be between the values of 1 and 100. And here's an example of how you specify min and max in SharePoint. Probably a little bit easier than the syntax in Capture Pro, but there is a special syntax in Capture Pro, and we'll make sure that input format automatically gets created based on how the SharePoint column was configured. So just like we have intelligent QC, we've got intelligent SharePoint integration in 3.0. We also support more SharePoint column types. So we support Boolean columns. In SharePoint, a Boolean column can either have a value of 0 or 1, which is a no or a yes. And so what we do in Capture Pro is we will automatically create a drop-down list with 2 valid entries. When the data gets output to SharePoint, the value will either be a 0 or 1 that actually gets stored in the SharePoint column. We provide better support for date-time columns because we automatically configure the output format to match what SharePoint is expecting. There's a certain format that every date field is configured for. and we read that configuration and then make sure the output format, because that's what ultimately determines what the format of the data is that's going to go to the output system, in this case SharePoint, will automatically configure that. So the input format could be anything, the key is the output format. In SharePoint there are things called choice columns which really match our drop-down list in Capture Pro. If I have a field like a state field or something where there's a limited number of values, like less than 50, let's say, or something like that, I go into SharePoint, I configure my choice column, I enter in my choices. Instead of having to manually enter all that stuff in Capture Pro, we'll automatically create a drop-down list index field from those choice values from SharePoint. And finally, we support lookup columns. A lookup column is something where you have a much larger list of values, of possible values, that are stored somewhere else in SharePoint in something called a SharePoint list. All right? And what a lookup column is going to do is it'll present a drop-down list in SharePoint and allow the user to look up and navigate and choose that particular value in SharePoint. You can even, with lookup columns, include multiple values for a column in SharePoint. So if I have an invoice that has line items on it, I can choose multiple values. So when that document gets indexed in SharePoint, you can actually have a column that has multiple values in it, and it's perfect for things like invoices. So we now will be able to support those lookup columns in Capture Pro version 3.0, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. This shaded blue stuff in these slides are the SharePoint configuration. And here is a column called Items Purchased. It's getting its information from the sporting good items list that's in SharePoint. And I've checked Allow Multiple Values. And we'll be able to configure Capture Pro to be able to output to these columns. And finally, we support more SharePoint site settings. In SharePoint, like any other content management system, even Lotus Notes has this, you can have versioning. You can have major versions and minor versions. And so what we do in Capture Pro is we'll allow you to specify whether the document that's being scanned and then stored in SharePoint is a major or a minor version. A minor version is typically a draft version, a major version would be the final version. Normally with things like scanned documents, you're not going to be modifying them, so chances are they won't be draft, they'll be the final version, but you may specify some sort of like versioning, and we'll fully support that. And we'll support the check-in options of SharePoint as well. You have an option to say I want to check in and whether this is a major or minor version. And this support for these site settings is intelligent. So Capture Pro won't let you enable the check-in option or won't let you enable major or minor if it's not enabled for the SharePoint site. We had a lot of problems with the SOD that we currently have where customers were outputting and the output was failing, and we didn't know why it was failing. Well, because somebody decided to check in, but the site didn't support check-in. So, now with the SharePoint Setup Index Wizard, part of the intelligence is we won't let you do certain things if the SharePoint site isn't enabled for it. And that's just going to make the integration and the overall testing of the integration go much better, because chances are the output's going to be more successful now the first time that you configure Capture Pro software for an output to SharePoint. So how do I access the SharePoint Setup Wizard? A button exists on all job setup screens. It's a nice big button. I think it's the largest button in Capture Pro software. Mainly because when you translate SharePoint Index Setup Wizard in the 15 languages, some of the languages are a very big translation string. And when you're finished setting up with the wizard, you will see there's a new output kind of a destination option called SharePoint 2007 and 2010, and that'll be checked. So that indicates that you've used the wizard to configure your SharePoint. Now, what if I have an existing output that's using, or an existing job setup that's using the existing system output format? That still exists, no problem. Those existing job setups will be unaffected. They'll still work. As you can see here, the SharePoint system output is still available. However, this output, this existing system output, has none of the new capabilities that we just talked about. It doesn't have the intelligence. It doesn't have the support of choice columns and better support for like lookup columns and the major and minor versioning and things like that. If you're a new customer, that's doing a new integration to SharePoint, you'd want to use the SharePoint Index Setup Wizard. But any existing integration will be fine. It'll actually, by default, choose all of the columns that have been set up. All right, but you have a choice if there's an optional column. In other words, it's not a required field. You'll have a choice to not map that and not create an index field for it. So now what I want to do is go through an example. And here is a view of a SharePoint site that I've configured called Express Ship Waybills. Now these SharePoint, this is actually not a site, this is a library. Okay, the site is what you actually connect to. Sometimes this could be a list, or it could be what in SharePoint 2010 is called the content type. There's different terminology for, I think content type is kind of the overarching term, and then a content type could either be a library or a list. In this particular case, this is a SharePoint library called Express Ship Waybills. You'll see there's lots of columns. There's a name column, which turns out that I've configured it to be the waybill number itself. And then there's columns for ship date, sender name, account number, address, city, state, zip code, etc. You'll see in our example that these are the columns that are going to be imported into the index fields. That's going to wind up creating index fields in Capture Pro. So you access the wizard from any screen in Job Setup. Here's the main screen. When I first go into Job Setup, I click on the button. First thing I need to do is I need to select a SharePoint site, or what we call a SharePoint connection. So what we've done in version 3.0, instead of embedding all your credentials in the URL as part of the setup of the system output format, as part of the wizard, you first have to select or create a SharePoint connection. And these connections are stored system-wide and can be used for all job setups that you might establish in Capture Pro. So I can either select an existing SharePoint connection or create a new one. And here I've established two different SharePoint connections. Because in a customer's SharePoint system, they may have different sites, and therefore that's why you'd want to establish different connections if you have a job set up for one site versus another site. Now if I decide that I need to edit or define a SharePoint connection, here's where you specify the URL for your SharePoint site, the user credentials, whether there's a specific user account or whether you're going to use the Windows login and password, and then the site name if available. A SharePoint system may have might have lots of different sites that contain libraries and lists and things like that. I also give the SharePoint connection a meaningful name, so when I go back on my previous screen, I can select that meaningful name as to what my SharePoint connection is going to be. So once I've established that, the first part of my wizard, and note that I've, in order just to make room on the screen, there's actually navigation buttons on the bottom of all of these screens. There'll be a next button and a back button, like any wizard. All right. But the first step of the wizard is to choose your SharePoint list or your library or your content type. And all of the SharePoint lists or libraries will be in a scrollable list, and I can select the one. So I've selected Express Ship Waybills to be the library that I'm going to create a job setup from. After I do that, the first thing I need to do is create index fields from SharePoint columns. So what's going to be displayed here are all of the SharePoint columns that it considers to be meaningful metadata columns. There's lots of other columns in a SharePoint library. There are a lot of, if you want to call it, overhead columns, or columns that contain information that's really only pertinent to SharePoint. There might be the modified user and the modified date. There's an ID for every single item that's stored in SharePoint. We won't display those columns because because you probably don't want to create an index field from those overhead columns, like so to speak, that are in SharePoint. But everything else is going to be shown here. The index field by default, that gets created, will have the same name as the column. And by default, we're going to check create index. So by default, we're going to create an index from every single SharePoint column. Now you have a choice of not doing that, but if the column is required, then it will force you to create an index field in Capture Pro. So these are the column types that are coming from SharePoint. This is a text column type and a choice column type, and here's a Boolean and a date time. And if the field is required in SharePoint, we will automatically say the field is also required in Capture Pro. This grid is editable. In other words, I can uncheck certain things. I can actually key in an input format right here if I want to establish an input format in Capture Pro, but there really wasn't anything specific in SharePoint that I could read. This is the default grid that's going to show up, and again by default it's going to create index fields for every column in the SharePoint library. Note that settings that are not automatically configured from the SharePoint library can be edited inline in the wizard, or you can wait till later and go back into the index field and just go into regular index setup and modify it. Let's say I have the waybill number, which is a column in SharePoint, and I'm really going to be capturing that in Capture Pro from a barcode. I will set up my barcode zone. I'll then go into the SharePoint index setup wizard, and I can, for the default value, click on the little drop-down list, get all my possible choices, and select my barcode zone as my default value. And I can do that inline right in the wizard. And like I said, I can also edit the input format if there isn't a format that gets brought over from SharePoint. Or I can leave this default value empty and again later on go back into index setup and make those changes. While I'm in the wizard, if I press the edit button, I will actually get brought to a GUI that looks exactly like index setup with the same user interface, etc. So I can go in and if I wanted to create a drop-down list or create substitute character, all the stuff that I can do in regular index setup. So again, I can either do it right here, right now while I'm in the wizard, or I can do it later on. There might be index fields that, as part of the workflow in the SharePoint site, you're not going to know at capture time, at Capture Pro software time, at scan time. So you might want to say, you know what, the sender address is something I'm not going to know, okay, during capture time. I don't want them entering that in Capture Pro, so I'll just uncheck create index and not create that index field. And it's not a required field, so the output to SharePoint is still going to be okay. All right, when I create that document, when it gets output to SharePoint. If I have a lookup column that's in my SharePoint site and that gets brought over, to create an index field in Capture Pro, because a lookup column is actually pointing somewhere else in the SharePoint site to a list. All right, it's kind of like a linked list for those of you who know programming or whatever, or like daisy chain type operation, So I can't pre-configure a lookup column right here in the wizard. So index fields created from SharePoint lookup columns must be manually configured. It's not going to bring anything over. All right, so I have to enter the input format and create a drop-down list, so on and so forth, manually. A lookup column index field should be configured as a drop-down list index type. And that's where we get to the importing of a drop-down list. We mainly added that because when you're going to support lookup fields in SharePoint, not only do you want to create an index field in Capture Pro, but you want to actually import the drop-down list from SharePoint as well, because that list does exist in the SharePoint world. And again, lookup columns are typically where you have lots of values that you want to have somebody select from. So after I've decided that here's all the index fields I want to create, and maybe there's some default values and some input formats that I'm going to specify, you now set up the index field mapping. And by default, we're going to map every single field that gets created in Capture Pro to its corresponding column. If the field is required, you must map it to an index field. If there's an optional column, then you don't have to specify a mapping, but then why would you create the index field in the first place in Capture Pro, right? So again, by default, we're going to do a one-to-one mapping between the index fields that were created and the columns in SharePoint. Now notice that this mapping doesn't have to be this one-to-one default. I may have a field in SharePoint that could be made up of more than one index field in Capture Pro. I may decide to key enter in, let's say, 3 different fields, and that's going to wind up being a single field in SharePoint. So in that case, I would remove the mapping from an index field, and I would click on this little button here. So if I click in the entry box for a Capture Pro index field, I can modify the default mapping for that column in SharePoint. So I could concatenate multiple fields, or I could even substring it. So just like I can create a default value kind of for an index field where I can concatenate barcode zones or OCR zones to create a single index field, and I can substring out the stuff, I can effectively do the same thing when I perform the index field mapping for a SharePoint column. So after I've done my index field mapping, I then complete my setup. So I'm brought to this last screen here. And in this last screen is where I can specify what type of file I'm going to output. And we support all the output types in Capture Pro: PDF, searchable PDF, PDFA. To me, it makes most sense that you would always choose multi-page output, because you're outputting a row of metadata. And that row of metadata typically is going to correspond to a document. And so, what you would output to SharePoint would be a single PDF file for that document, so it's a multi-page PDF. It could contain multiple images. So each document in Capture Pro would be output as a single entity in SharePoint. I don't have to do that. I can do single page, and I could create a folder and have all those images reside in a folder. But to me, it makes logically more sense you'd want to output an entire document as one file to SharePoint. So all the output types, so I go in, I would select my output type, I go into the options, and I can do multi-page or single page, etc. I can specify the starting folder for this SharePoint library. In this case, I'm storing documents at the root. There isn't an existing folder, but for instance, you may have a folder for every single express ship location, and you want all of the waybills that are scanned at that location to go into a folder. So you could specify the starting folder for this particular location where you're scanning documents. I can also create a subfolder structure based on metadata, based on the index data in Capture Pro, or system metadata. And in this case, I've said, well, you know what? I have a station name established, so I'm going to, if the folder's not already created, it'll create the folder, and then it'll store all of the documents that I scan into this folder. Or I could choose to not have any structure and just immediately store it right to the root of the SharePoint library. So after I specify my folders and my file types, I can then choose whether I want to check in that document, whether it's a major or minor version, and what comments I might have if I do check it in. And again, part of the intelligent support. In this example down below, I've decided, well, I'm going to check this in as a minor version. Well, it won't let me, because it says the current configuration of this SharePoint list does not allow minor versions to be created. So it'll tell me that I have something wrong. If I did this in the system output format, and then I outputted it, it would fail. And I'd get a message that comes from SharePoint that would be very hard to understand, and I wouldn't know what happened. So intelligently, we're telling you can't do that. All right? So that's part of the value of what we're doing in version 3.0. The question is, would these check-in options be applicable to all of the different document types that I might want to output to this SharePoint library? In SharePoint, these options are library specific, so it's not specific, at least to my knowledge, to the type of document you're outputting from Capture Pro, whether it's a PDF or a TIFF or whatever it is. SharePoint isn't configured specifically to the type of file that's being uploaded. But to me, it makes sense, since you're creating scan documents that typically cannot be altered, because they're mainly image documents, right? That you would probably within Capture Pro say I want this to be a major version. When I put this into the SharePoint site, I want to immediately say it's the final version. But you have to realize that customers could upload Word documents or Excel documents from their own application into SharePoint, and that might be a minor version going in. So it really depends upon the configuration of the SharePoint library as to what's allowed. The question is, are the check-in options applicable to everything, all the documents in the batch? And I go, yes, this is a job setup option. So every single document will be checked in with the comments or not, as a major or minor version. You would have to set up a different job setup and modify it slightly and scan those separately into different jobs. The question was, what if I had documents that were minor and other ones that were major, and I wanted to scan them in the same batch? And the answer is, at least the way we've set it up, you can't do that because you can't change the check-in options kind of on the fly. The question is do you have required fields in SharePoint? Does it force you to create an index? I believe the answer is yes. I believe that if you have a required field in SharePoint, it's a required column type, and you don't have a corresponding index field for it, it's not going to let you continue in the wizard, all right, until you correct that. Now I can go back into the wizard later on, all right, because I might want to edit something. I might want to, somebody added another column and now I want to add that as an index field. What's going to happen when you re-enter the wizard is for all the fields that are where there's already index fields created, this create index is going to be unchecked, because I already have an index field created for this column, right? It's already maps. So it'll actually give me an error saying, well, I can't create an index for this because the field's already created, for this column. So the answer to your question, Joy, is if you have a required field in SharePoint, you must have a corresponding index field in Capture Pro, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to output the document because there's no metadata for that column. So I believe in the wizard, if you want to say next and you don't have this check for a required field, it's not going to it's going to give you an error. So after I complete the setup, a summary screen will come up. It'll check this option saying that you've gone through the wizard. A summary screen is going to come up. It's going to tell you here's all the things that you set up. So it's kind of nice. Here's the SharePoint site. Here's the URL. These are my output options. And here are my column and my column mapping. And then you're done. So after I go through the wizard, here's all the created index fields. So I go back into index setup, or I go to the index tab in job setup, and I see all of my index fields here, including things like drop-down lists that were automatically created from Boolean fields or choice fields, output formats for date, time fields, etc. And if I had any input format information, for instance, the default, it created an input format for me for my date, time field. But if I had a range of values or something that was in the SharePoint site, I would see these input formats being filled in here. If we take a look at an index field with a drop-down list, all right, that was created from a choice column. So the drop-down list is automatically created from the choice list in SharePoint. Here's the column in SharePoint where I had the column was called state, and it was a choice field, and I actually went in and manually entered in, very similar to how we create index fields today manually in Capture Pro. I do that same thing in SharePoint. It's going to automatically bring all these values over into Capture Pro. Really nice. So I don't have to re-enter that stuff in twice. If I click on this setup button to see the contents of the list in a little more detail, if the list is not sorted for some reason, and when I want to display the drop-down list to the user in Capture Pro, I can click on the value column header to sort the list. Now, what if my choices change in SharePoint and I want to make sure that Capture Pro has all the same choices that were in SharePoint? So, for instance, we have a state field. The U.S. has decided to annex, Alberta or something like that in Canada as a new state. I go into my SharePoint site, I add Alberta as another state. I need to go and now add that in Capture Pro. Well, I can't go through the wizard, all right, and just re-import that choice column because the index field is already created in Capture Pro. So my choices are, I can either manually edit the drop-down list like I do today when I create a drop-down list and add Alberta and click add and add that, or I can delete the index field in Capture Pro and then go back into the SharePoint wizard, because the field isn't created, I don't have a mapping anymore, it'll automatically add that field again, bring in all of those new choices, and I have my index field fully updated and in sync with my column in SharePoint. So the question is, if I go back into the wizard, will it redo everything that I've already, will it remap and change the input format and so on and so forth? And the answer is actually no, it won't. Okay, if there's an index field already created and there's a mapping already created, going through the index wizard won't update the index field in Capture Pro. I would have to remove the index field from the index and then it would then create a new one. I would have to first delete the index field from Pro and then go through the wizard, and it'll bring all those updates over. Because it's a lookup column, it's a little bit easier to update drop-down lists from lookup fields than it is here. I don't have to delete my index field and then redo it. There's another mechanism for that. Drop-down list import provides the ability to automatically populate drop-down list entries instead of manually keying in each entry. Really nice. So if you have a list of employee IDs and you want the end user experience in Capture Pro if somebody has to manually enter the employee ID because it's not coming from a barcode field or something like that, it might be easier for them from an end user experience to have that be in a drop-down list. So now I can import, and I could have thousands of entries. So much easier to import that drop-down list instead of manually keying in all that information. So the list can be imported from either a SharePoint library or from an ODBC compliant data source, whether it's a database like Access or SQL Server, or an Excel file or a text or CSV file. Say I want a drop-down list, I click on Setup, and I can import the list. All right, from another source. Very convenient. New in version 3.0 is the support of multiple value drop-down lists. And this was specifically added to provide support for multiple value SharePoint lookup columns. And we'll go through that specific example. So, like again, I have an invoice, I have a line item. I may decide that I want multiple values, okay, for that single index field, all right, in Capture Pro. So notice there's a new selection when I say I want a multiple value drop-down list. If I do single value drop-down list selection, I click on the drop-down list and I just highlight the item and it's going to select that for me. With multiple value selection, again supported specifically for SharePoint, there are checkboxes and I would check all that apply basically. Here's all the items that I want to assign to that index field. So now let's go through an example of how this works. So I enter the drop-down list setup dialog with index field setup. My list is empty. I click on import list. I must either select a SharePoint connection, identical to the connection that we just talked about with the SharePoint Index Setup Wizard, or a database connection. And this dialog will list all of the connections that I've established. The SharePoint connections are identical to the SharePoint Wizard connections that we talked about earlier. So I can either select an existing connection or create a new one. And all connections are stored system-wide and are available to any job setup. For a database connection, I click on the Browse button to select an ODBC compliant data source that I've already set up. So if I want to import from a Excel file or a text file or a SQL database, I've got to create an ODBC source exactly the same way I create an ODBC source for database lookup. And then I browse and select that source. So the data source must be configured for the database or the Excel file or the text file that contains the entries that are going to be imported into the drop-down list. Once I do that, I must select the database table or the SharePoint list that's associated with the connection that I just selected. If I have a SharePoint library as my connection, or a SharePoint site for that matter, I would select my SharePoint list, all right, that I'm going to be importing the drop-down list from. If I have an ODBC database, I would select the database table of that database where I'm going to be importing my drop-down list entries from. And then I would select the columns for the value and description of the drop-down list. Note that when you create a drop-down list in Capture Pro, and I'm just going to navigate back real quickly, there's a value and description that gets presented to the end user. We need to map the columns in the database or the columns in the SharePoint library to value and description that make up the drop-down list in Capture Pro. And then I click on the import button and it'll import stuff in. Now note that when you have a lookup column in SharePoint and you're importing columns, okay, to be brought into the drop-down list, what actually gets stored in a lookup column in a SharePoint library is not the actual value of metadata that's going to be displayed to the user in SharePoint. So if I have a list of employee IDs in SharePoint, I'm not actually and that's associated with the lookup column in my library. So the lookup column is pointing to a list of employee IDs somewhere else in my SharePoint site. What actually gets stored in the lookup column is not the employee ID, because that data is already in SharePoint, or in a SharePoint list. What actually gets stored is the ID. It's the ID for the employee number. So for SharePoint lookup columns, the ID column, okay, must be selected, for either the value or description. Otherwise, the output's not going to work. Now, this is not intelligent, meaning that we won't force the ID. We don't know at this point whether it's really a lookup column or not. When I say must, it means in order for the output to be successful and actually work, one of the items, one of the columns in the SharePoint list that must be part of the drop-down list in Capture Pro must be the ID column. Note that the ID field in a SharePoint view is often hidden from the end user in SharePoint. They don't even know that the ID column even exists. It's like one of these overhead metadata columns like the modified date and the user and all this other kind of stuff. All right? Or last modified date or something like that. However, when the batch is output to SharePoint, the output value for the index field must contain the ID that was imported in from SharePoint. I click on Import, and it's going to create my list. Importing the list. So if I import the list again, so let's say updating the list, it's not dynamic. When we present the drop-down list to the user, we're only going to present what's in the list in Capture Pro. We don't dynamically go out to the ODBC database and say, oh, there's 17 new entries and automatically update the list. We don't go out to the SharePoint list and automatically say, oh, this lookup, this list that's associated with this lookup column now has 400 more items that can be purchased at Richard Sporting Goods. We won't automatically do that. You have to actually go in and consciously go in and say, I'm going to re-import this list. Okay? So importing the list again will update any existing entries automatically. The ID is not going to change, all right, for a SharePoint list, but the description might change. So it'll automatically update any existing entries. Notice that in the list that exists in Capture Pro, the value, whatever the value is kind of the key entry, if you want to call it, to the list within Capture Pro. So it's going to go out and say, if there's any new values, it'll automatically add them to the list. And if the value already exists, it's just going to update it based on what column I've associated with my description. So it'll update any existing entries. Any new entries will automatically be added. Re-importing the list will not delete entries that no longer exist. So if Richard Sporting Goods has decided to discontinue 100 items, re-importing the list won't automatically delete those items. So what do you do in that case? You would hit the Delete All button, and this is brand new to Capture Pro 3.0, clear out your list, and then re-import it, and then it'll bring everything back in again. But it's very fast. It's a very nice way of doing it. So that's how you update your list, Capture Pro. Completing the import for SharePoint lookup columns. Remember we talked about it's real important. What needs to get output and stored in the lookup column is this ID field that we imported. Notice for drop-down lists, the indexing action specifies what value will get output during batch processing. So for SharePoint lookup columns, the ID column value that was imported must be output. So in this example, the ID column was assigned to the value part of the drop-down list. Therefore, I must configure the indexing action to be use value only. The end user experience will always display the value and description. When you output the batch, the indexing action says what's going to get output, my index file or to my SharePoint site or to my downstream system. If I had the ID from SharePoint as the description, then I would make sure I use description only on output. Again, I can sort the list by clicking on the column to make it easier for somebody to find something in the list.